The wind in Willow Trace had teeth on that late November night. It came howling down from the high mesas, a bitter, scouring thing that ripped at the canvas signs of the general store and the dry goods emporium. It found its best purchase at the top of the hill, where the steeple of St. Bartram's Church clawed at a sky bruised purple with unfallen snow. The church flag, a heavy linen banner bleached by 10 years of high plain sun, snapped and cracked like a mule driver's whip. Beneath it, the bell tolled. It was not the steady, measured ring of a summons to prayer or the joyous peal of a wedding. This was a ragged, frantic sound, a clanging punctuation to the wind's howl. The rope was old, the hemp frayed, and the ringer was pulling with more desperation than rhythm. It was a sound that made people burrow deeper into their blankets. Or, for the more curious, edge a curtain back from a cold pane of glass. On the church steps, Mara Delaney was not listening to the bell. She was trying to become small enough for the wind to forget her. She was huddled against the rough-hewn pine of the church doors, her body drawn into a tight knot of shivering misery. The dress she wore had been, perhaps that morning, a thing of fine white cotton and delicate lace. Now, it was a ruin. The hem was dark with mud and water, shredded by branches and brambles. One sleeve was torn from shoulder to elbow, revealing the angry, blooming purple of a fresh bruise on her upper arm. A fine thread of Belgian lace, a luxury in this part of the country, had snagged on a rusted nailhead near the door frame, tethering her to the spot like a trapped animal. Her collar, once stiff and white, was now a limp, gray rag against her skin, stained with the dark, rich mud from the well field behind the church. She was not crying. The time for tears had passed, frozen somewhere back in the suffocating darkness of the rectory study. Now, there was only the cold, a physical presence that had sunk past her skin and into her bones. He came from the shadows of the livery stable, a place no decent man had business being at this hour. He moved like the shadow itself, not hurried, but with a long, ground-eating stride that spoke of a life spent walking over rough country. He was a tall man, made taller by the night, and his presence was a sudden, solid interruption of the wind. He stopped a few feet from her. Mara only knew he was there because the wind's direct assault on her back had ceased, replaced by a sudden stillness. She did not look up. She could not. Coulter Vance, the proprietor of the Ash Mesa Ranch, a place so remote and solitary most folks in Willow Trace only knew it as a name on a tax ledger, looked at the woman on the steps for a long, silent moment. He took in the torn dress, the raw scrape on her cheekbone, and the way her left hand was clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white stones in the gloom. He had seen colts freeze in fear during a blizzard, and she had that same terrible stillness. He said nothing. Instead, he unfastened the top buttons of his coat. It was a heavy thing, dark wool lined with sheepskin, smelling of wood smoke, horse, and the faint, clean bite of pine. He shrugged it from his own shoulders and, in one smooth motion, draped it over hers. The weight of it was a shock, a sudden, encompassing warmth that made her gasp. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together in a dry creek bed. Just stay standing. It was not a question. It was not an offer of comfort. It was a simple, direct instruction. He made no move to touch her further, but stood near, a bulwark against the night. The sound of the bell stopped, cut off mid-clang. In the abrupt silence, new sounds rushed in. The creak of a door hinged from the house across the street, a window sash sliding up an inch in the boarding house. The town of Willow Trace was awake, and it was watching. From the cracks in drawn curtains, from the alleyways and the dark porches, the whispers started, weaving themselves into the fabric of the wind. "Is that? Lord have mercy, it is. Kerr's girl, his ward, running from the wedding dressed like that. He'll have her hide. He'll have his hide, more like the one who's with her." Inside the church, a stove door clanged shut. A moment later, a thick plume of smoke, smelling of pitchy pine and desperation, billowed from the chimney. Mingling with the cold, wet smell of the impending snow, It was a scent of false warmth, a sanctuary that had become a prison. A dark, muddy track, marked by the deep, panicked imprints of a woman's narrow shoe and the dragged scrape of a man's heavier boot, led from the side door of the rectory, past the woodpile, and toward the stone housing of the town well. It was a map of a struggle. Mara kept her gaze fixed on the ground. She was aware of the man beside her, of the heavy coat that was beginning to thaw the ice in her veins. She focused on his boots. They were old, caked with the reddish dust of the high mesa, the leather cracked and worn, the soles resoled at least twice. They were the boots of a man who worked, a man who stood on his own ground. She trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that rattled her teeth. But she did not beg. She would not. She had nothing left to beg with. The heavy church doors were thrown open, spilling a rectangle of suffocating yellow light onto the steps. In the doorway stood Reverend Silas Kerr. He was not a large man, but he filled the space, his black frock coat seeming to drink the light around him. His hair was a silver helmet, perfectly combed, and his face was a mask of pastoral concern. His lips pulled into a smile that did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was a river of warm honey. It was the voice he used for funerals and baptisms, the voice that soothed widows and charmed land commissioners. "Mara, my child, what is this? The night air is too sharp for you. Come, let the coldness of your heart be warmed. Bring the lamb back to the fold." He took a step forward, one hand outstretched, the gesture one of benevolent retrieval. Coulter Vance shifted. It was a small movement, less than a half step, but it put him squarely between Mara and the Reverend's outstretched hand. He did not look at Kerr. He kept his gaze on the darkness of the street beyond, as if listening for something only he could hear. "She's leaving with me," Coulter said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind and the Reverend's honeyed tone like a honed blade. "On her own will." The smile on Kerr's face tightened. The mask slipped, revealing the granite beneath. "Sir, you mistake the situation. This is a church matter, a family matter. The girl is overwrought. She is my ward, and she is to be my wife, by contract, this very night." "She said no," Coulter stated. It was a flat, final thing. "She is a child, and she is confused," Kerr snapped, his voice losing its polish. He lunged, not for Coulter, but for Mara, his hand grabbing for the collar of the coat. As he moved, his other hand, which had been hidden in the folds of his sleeve, jerked forward. A piece of paper, folded and crumpled, slipped from his cuff and fluttered to the wooden step. Kerr froze. His eyes darted from the paper to Coulter, then back. Coulter glanced down. The paper had landed face up, illuminated by the spill of light from the church. It was a legal form. Cheap foolscap, but the writing on it was bold and black. At the bottom, a heavy crimson stamp was clearly visible. Even in the poor light, the seal of Sable County, Judge Obadiah Trammell, and beneath it, two signatures. One, Silas Kerr, the other, a shaky, unpracticed X. Kerr's hand was still in the air, his fingers curled into a claw. Coulter looked at the paper. He looked at the judge's seal. He looked at the X. He filed the information away. A piece of a puzzle he was only just beginning to see. He had dealt with Trammell before, over water rights. He knew what that stamp meant. Kerr, seeing his authority laid bare on the wooden step, scrambled to recover it. He snatched for the paper, but the wind was faster, skittering it just out of his reach. In that moment of distraction, Mara leaned forward, her lips close to Coulter's ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound nearly stolen by the wind, but it was raw and full of iron. "They want my mother's land," she breathed, the words scalding and fast. "The Sedgewater Creek writes, it was never about me. It was never about anything but the land." The ride to Ash Mesa was silent, broken only by the plodding of Coulter's horse and the sharp, rhythmic jingle of the harness. He had pulled Mara up behind him, her small weight barely registering. She was still wrapped in his coat, a dark shroud against the tattered white of her dress. She held onto the cantle of his saddle. Not onto him. The wind was a living thing, pushing against them, trying to turn them back toward the judgment of Willow Trace. Coulter did not turn. It was a 2-hour ride in the dark, climbing from the shallow basin of the town into the high, broken country of the mesas. He did not take her to his main ranch house. He cut north toward a line shack tucked into a cleft of red rock, a place he used during spring calving. It was one room, built of pine logs chinked with mud, and it was as solitary as the man who built it. He swung down and reached up for her. Her muscles were locked. She slid, stiff and unyielding, into his arms. He set her on her feet and turned to the door, his hand never lingering on her. He pushed the door open. The inside was dark, cold, and smelled of things that lasted cured leather, old wood smoke, coffee grounds, and the faint, mineral scent of the horses he'd kept stabled against the far wall in winter. It was the smell of a life lived without softness. Coulter moved with an economy of motion. He lit the hurricane lamp on the table, and the small room flickered to life. A rough sawn plank table, 2 3-legged stools, a cast-iron stove, cold and dark, a narrow cot in the corner. His saddle, thrown over a sawhorse, dominated the space near the empty hearth. He guided Mara to one of the stools, a simple nudge at her elbow. "Sit." She sat. She was still shivering, a deep, cellular tremor that the coat's wool could not stop. He did not coddle her. He went to the stove, knelt, and with practiced hands, built a fire. He used shavings of dry pine and a few split logs from the box beside the door. Within minutes, the stove was ticking as the metal heated, and a small, fierce warmth began to push back the night's chill. He filled a blackened pot with water from a barrel in the corner and set it on the stove to heat. He moved to a small shelf, taking down 2 tin mugs and a small cloth sack of coffee. From another canister, he pulled a handful of dried chamomile flowers. When the water was steaming, he made his own coffee first, pouring the scalding water over the grounds in his mug, creating a brew as black and bitter as the wind outside. Then, he rinsed the pot and steeped the chamomile. He placed the second mug in front of her. The steam rose in a fragrant, pale cloud. She stared at it as if it were a puzzle. "It's just tea," he said. She raised her eyes to his for the first time. They were gray, exhausted, but with a hard, defiant light deep within them. She did not thank him. She wrapped her frozen hands around the hot tin, wincing as the feeling began to return. Coulter sat opposite her, cradling his own mug. He drank his coffee, his gaze directed at the fire visible through the stove's small grate. He did not press her. He did not ask her what happened, who had torn her dress, or why a reverend would be holding a wedding by force at 10 o'clock at night. The line shack was a place outside of Willow Trace. The silence was a buffer, a place for her to land. He let it stand, solid as the log walls around them. She drank the tea in small, bird-like sips. The warmth unknotted something in her. He watched as the rigid line of her shoulders softened, her breathing deepening. Finally, her eyes, heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond the body, began to close. "The cot," he said, nodding toward it. "Get what rest you can." She looked at the narrow bed, then back at him, a flicker of the initial fear returning. "I'll be by the stove," he said. He pulled the other stool near the hearth, turning his back to her, offering her the small privacy of his disinterest. He heard her move, the scuff of the borrowed boots he'd insisted she take from the stable, the rustle of the cot's straw mattress. For an hour, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind. Then, a short, strangled cry. He was on his feet, but did not turn. "You're at Ash Mesa," he said to the wall. "You're safe." He heard her gasping, trying to pull air back into her lungs. A nightmare. He stood for a moment, listening to her quiet, desperate sobs. He was not a man built for comfort. He knew work, he knew horses, and he knew the land. He did not know this. He went to his saddlebag, rummaged inside, and pulled out a small, brass bell, no bigger than his thumb. It was a hawk bell, one he'd meant to put on a new saddle. He went to the door, opened the latch, and tied the bell securely to the leather thong of the handle. He tested it. The sound was small, but clear and sharp in the quiet room. Mara had pushed herself up on one elbow, watching him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. He gestured to the door. "If the latch moves, it rings. You'll hear anyone coming." She sank back onto the cot, pulling his coat up to her chin. Her eyes closed. Coulter stepped outside into the biting cold. The night was vast, the stars sharp chips of ice. The wind had brought the sound of coyotes, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. It was a lonely, hungry sound. He looked at the door of the shack. The crossbar was a simple piece of milled lumber, held in place by 2 iron brackets. It would hold against a wolf, but not a determined man. He went to the woodpile, found a length of seasoned oak he'd set aside for an axle repair, and brought it back. He took his knife and, in the thin moonlight, began to whittle the ends, shaping it to fit the brackets more snugly. He worked for nearly an hour, the simple, physical act of making something stronger settling his mind. When he was done, the new bar was twice as thick, a solid, visible line of defense. He slid it into place, a good, tight fit. When he re-entered the shack, she was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, his coat around her shoulders, her hair a wild tangle. The fake marriage contract, the one he had plucked from the step after Kerr had scrambled away, was in her lap. She had taken it from his coat pocket. "He said it was to save my soul," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "He said an orphan girl with land was a temptation to sin, and he would protect me by joining our names, by joining his name to my land." Coulter poured more water into the pot on the stove. He did not look at her. He wanted the sedge water. He wanted the water rights, she confirmed, her voice gaining a cold strength. "My mother left it all to me, in trust, until I turned 21. That's in 6 months. Kerr found out." She touched the crumpled paper. "He and Judge Trammell drew this up. He said if I would not be his wife by choice, I would be by law. He tried to make me sign it. When I would not, he held my hand. He made my ex." Coulter's hand tightened on the handle of the tin pot. He said nothing. He remembered his wife, Ellen. He remembered the drought of 1878. He remembered watching the creek behind their house dry up, first to a trickle, then to damp mud, then to cracked, white dust. He remembered how Ellen's cough had worsened as the dust rose. The land had grown brittle, and she had grown brittle with it. Sickness took her, but it was the drought, the powerlessness, the loss of the water, that had broken her spirit. He had buried her on the hill overlooking the dry creek bed. After that, he had chosen this life. He had built his ranch on solitude, on the principle that what you did not have, you could not lose. He had fenced his land, and he had fenced his heart. He had chosen this quiet, this emptiness, specifically to never again feel the rage and the helplessness of watching something precious be taken from him. And now this woman, this piece of driftwood from a storm he did not know, had washed up in his one-room shelter, bringing the world with her. The gray light of dawn found them both still awake. The light was cruel, revealing the dirt, the bruises, the exhaustion. It filled the cabin with a cold, unforgiving clarity. Mara stood, the greatcoat falling to her ankles. She looked small, a child playing dress-up, but her eyes were not a child's. "I will not be a burden, Mr. Vance," she said. "I have chores," he replied. He found her a pair of his own boots. They were ridiculously large, but they were thick leather, and they would protect her from the sharp rock. She followed him out. The new calves, born late in the season, were in a small holding pen, their mothers lowing nervously. "We move them to the lower pasture," he said. "They need shelter from the wind." It was simple work, but physical. Opening gates, guiding the hesitant calves, blocking their mothers from turning back. Mara was clumsy in the huge boots, but she was quick, and she did not complain. She did as he instructed, her face set in concentration. The sun rose higher, a hard, bright disk, and the morning light was sharp. It caught the raw, chafed skin on her wrists. Where the lace of her dress was ground in with dirt, he saw the distinct, parallel bruises, the shape of fingers. Coulter stopped. He walked to his horse, still saddled from the night before, and unstrapped a roll from behind the cantle. He pulled out a pair of worn leather work gloves, the palms stained dark with sweat and lanolin. He walked back to her and held them out. She looked at the gloves, then at his face. He was offering her the tools of his world. She reached for them, and for a half-second, her fingers brushed his calloused palm. It was not a caress. It was a spark, a simple, physical fact, as real as the rock under their feet, a jolt of warmth, of life, that had nothing to do with pity. She pulled the gloves on. They were stiff, but they were a shield. She turned back to the calf she was hurting, but then stopped. She looked at him, the harsh sunlight full on her face, hiding nothing. "I don't need saving, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the thin air. "I'm not a lost lamb. I need time, and I need paper. My mother's paper." Coulter Vance looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the grit beneath the terror. He saw the iron. He had taken her word against a man of God, against the seal of a judge. He had no reason to stop now. He gave a single, short nod. He looked past her, toward the distant, unseen line of Sedgewater Creek, a place he now knew was a map of a crime. "Then we start with the truth." Coulter rode out before the sun had crested the eastern mesa, leaving Mara at the line shack with a loaded shotgun and a firm instruction. "Don't open this door for God himself. If you hear shooting, take the mule and ride west into the canyons. Don't follow the trail." He did not ride to Willow Trace. He took the long way, circling wide to the south, to the town of Sable, the county seat. It was a 4-hour ride, and he pushed his horse. Sable was a different kind of town, built on paper and law, not on faith and whispers. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building, the biggest structure in the county, and it pretended at importance. The Sable County Records Office was in the basement, a single, cramped room that smelled of damp plaster, aging paper, and Mrs. Lindell's dried lavender. Mrs. Agatha Lindell was a small, bird-like woman who had sat behind the same oak desk for 30 years. She wore a pair of spectacles so thick they made her eyes look like worried oysters. She was also the most informed and, Coulter suspected, the most dangerous person in the county. She looked up when he entered, the small bell over the door jingling. Her eyes took him in the ash mesa dust on his coat, the exhaustion, the controlled tension in his shoulders. She did not smile. "Mr. Vance, an unexpected visit. I trust your cattle are well." "They're fine, Mrs. Lindell," Coulter said, removing his hat. "I'm not here about cattle. I'm here about land. Delaney." Her hands, which had been sorting a stack of deeds, went still. "The Delaney file is active." "I don't want the active file," Coulter said, his voice quiet. "I want the old file, from when Eleanor Delaney was alive, before Reverend Kerr became the executor." "Mrs." Lindell looked at him over the top of her spectacles. "The archives are particular. You'll need a reason." "A reason," Coulter said, "is that I believe a crime is being committed, and the proof of it is in this room." He had not raised his voice. He stated it as a fact, like saying the sky was blue. "Mrs." Lindell was silent for a long count. She was paid by the county, which meant she was paid by Judge Trammell, but she had also known Eleanor Delaney. Finally, she nodded, a short, sharp dip of her chin. "Section 4, Water Rights and Surveys. Be tidy." It took him less than 10 minutes. The old files were thinner. He found what he was looking for, bound in a faded blue ribbon, and inside, just as Mara had said, was her mother's work. It was not a professional survey, but a diary of the land, filled with hand-drawn maps, notes on soil, and, crucially, a chart of the Sedgewater Creek's water levels, documented over 3 years, including the drought of 78. She filed this herself. "Mrs." Lindell said, her voice soft, startling him. She had come to stand beside him. "I told her it wasn't a legal plat. She said, 'The law may be a fool, Agatha, but the land isn't. I want the land's voice on the record. Strange woman. Smart. She was. Coulter said. He committed the map to memory. While you're here. Mrs., Lindell said, her tone suddenly casual. You might find the new railroad plats of interest. They're changing the face of the county. Progress. She gestured to a large, newly bound ledger on the main table. Coulter moved to it. The Sable County Western Spur Line. A private venture. He unrolled the top map. He saw the name before he saw the line. The chief investor and president of the board, Mr. Horace Bly. The proposed route was a thick, confident red line cutting straight across the county. It hit the Delaney property. And then it stopped. Precisely at the bank of Sedgewater Creek. To continue west, it had to cross. Coulter looked at the new map, then at the image of Eleanor Delaney's water-level chart in his mind. Bly's railroad was trying to build on the exact spot that Eleanor had marked as the drought spring, the one place the water always surfaced. He looked up at Mrs. Lindell. They need the crossing? They need the right-of-way, she corrected softly. Horace Bly has been in town for 2 months. He and Judge Trammell and Reverend Kerr, they have had many suppers together, discussing the future, the great and abiding progress that will lift us all. The pieces clicked into place, cold and sharp. Bly needed the land. Trammell provided the legal cover. And Kerr provided the girl, the fake contract, the X on the line. It was a performance to give Kerr, as Mara's new husband, the legal authority to sign away her inheritance to Bly's railroad. They were selling her land out from under her, and the wedding was the final, ugly step to make it legal. I need to make a copy, Coulter said. We do not copy, Mr. Vance. We transcribe, for a small fee. I'll need some time. The fee is 50 cents. She turned her back to him and began, very slowly, to clean her spectacles. Coulter worked fast. He was not a scholar, but he had a surveyor's eye. He took out the new notebook and pencil he had bought for this purpose. He transcribed the coordinates from Eleanor's map. He copied the dates of filing. He noted the page and volume number of the Delaney deed and the Bly Railroad plat. He drew the creek, the high water mark, the low water mark, and the spot marked spring. When he was done, he closed the notebook. He placed a silver dollar on the desk. Mrs. Lindell, her back still to him, did not move. The fee was 50 cents, she said. I'm paying for the quiet. Coulter replied. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the latch. She was a smart woman, he said. Yes, Mrs. Lindell whispered, not turning. And her daughter is a fool if she thinks she's the only one who remembers. Coulter left. As his footsteps faded, Mrs. Lindell walked to the desk. She looked at the silver dollar. She slid it into her drawer and then pulled out a small cloth bag from her reticule. It was a block of Jamaican coffee, a rare and expensive treat. Coulter had left it on the chair by the door. She picked it up, weighed it in her hand, and for the first time that day, a small, grim smile touched her lips. A silent, untraceable trade. Coulter's business was not finished. He went to the general store. The air in Willow Trace had been tense. In Sable, it was simply indifferent. But as he tied his horse, he saw them, 2 men, lounging on the boardwalk. They were not Willow Trace men. They were hard, bored-looking men, the kind that followed a payroll. They wore new boots and pistols tied low. Bly's men. They watched him, their eyes flat. Inside the store, Coulter bought flour, bacon, salt, and 2 boxes of .44 caliber cartridges. The storekeeper, seeing the men outside, added up the bill with nervous, fumbling fingers. Got trouble, Mr. Vance? The storekeeper asked, not meeting his eye, just buying supplies. Coulter said. As he left, he heard one of Bly's men say to the other, That's the one from Ash Mesa. Kerr's girl ran to him. The other spat into the dust. Don't matter, girl's gone, but the paper's still moving. Bly gets what he pays for. The ride back was fast, Coulter's eyes constantly scanning the ridge lines. He made it to the shack just as the sun was touching the rocks, turning the world a deep, bruised red. Mara was at the door before he'd even dismounted, the shotgun in her hands. She lowered it when she saw it was him. He walked past her, dropping the supplies on the table. He did not speak, just unrolled the saddlebags and pulled out the new leather notebook. He opened it on the plank table. "This is your land," he said, tapping the drawing. "This is the creek, and this is the railroad." Mara stared at the crude map. "I don't understand." "Bly's railroad. He needs to cross your land, right here. He needs your water. Kerr and Trammell were going to give it to him. That's what the wedding was for." Mara's face was pale. He said it was about my soul." "It's about money," Coulter said, his voice hard. "It's always about money or water. This time, it's both." He looked at her. "He failed to get your signature, but he has that contract. He'll try to file it. We need more than my word. We need your mother's." He nodded to the small, oilcloth bundle she had never let out of her sight. "Is it in there?" Mara's hands went to the bundle. From it, she pulled a worn, canvas-bound journal. Her mother's. I can read some," she said, her voice small, ashamed. "Reverend Kerr said a full education was a vanity. He stopped my lessons. He was afraid," Coulter said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "He took the book. He was afraid of this." He sat her down at the table. He lit the lamp, pushing back the shadows. We learn now." For 2 hours, they sat side by side, their shoulders nearly touching. He pointed, his calloused finger tracing the faded ink. "This word is boundary. This one is marker. This is creek." Her voice was hesitant at first, sounding out the syllables. Then it grew stronger, as the ghost of her mother's handwriting became her mother's voice in the small, quiet room. And then she found it. August 10th, 1877, she read, her finger now tracing the line. "Papa and I rode the line. He showed me the cheat, the rope stretcher's trick. He called it, how they'll move a marker in a curve to steal 100 acres. He said to never trust a pin. Always trust the land. Our land." He said, "Our line is true. Boundary marker number 3. Set by the old sycamore, the one struck by lightning." She drew it. On the page was a small, clear sketch, a large, split-trunk tree, a pile of rocks, and a note. 10 paces due west from the blaze on the trunk." Mara's head came up, her eyes wide and fierce. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice shaking. "Marker number 3 isn't at the sycamore. I've seen it. Kerr's men were repairing fences last month. It's at the dry wash. It's almost half a mile east." Coulter looked at the journal, at the map he had drawn, and then at her. "They moved it, the oldest land grab in the book. They were stealing the land before they even tried to steal your name. Then we move it back," Mara said, her jaw set. "And it becomes our word against a judge and a reverend. We'll be arrested for trespass and fraud before the sun sets. Then what we let them." "No," Coulter said. He stood and walked to the door, looking out at the night. "We move it back, but we have a witness. An unimpeachable one. Someone the town will believe." "Who?" Mara said, her hope fading. "Mrs. Lindell. She'll never leave her office. Not her." Mara's mind raced. Who in Willow Trace was free from Kerr's influence, who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose? Her mind settled on a small, neat house by the edge of town, a house that always smelled of baking bread and ironing. "Mother Taft," she breathed. Coulter turned, his eyebrow raised. "The seamstress Mara. The woman is 80 years old, and she's blind as a bat." "She's not blind," Mara said, standing. "She's illiterate. She can't read a wanted poster, and she can't read your map. But she doesn't need to. She's lived on that creek for 60 years. She delivered my mother. She sewed my mother's burial dress." She walked over to him, her eyes intense. Her hands, "Mr. Vance." Her hands remember. She can tell the age of moss on a stone with a single touch. She knows the smell of the mud from the true bank versus the dry wash. She's the only person in Willow Trace who can read the land. Not with her eyes, but with her fingers. She's the one. She is our witness. Coulter stared at her. It was the most insane, brilliant, frontier justice idea he had ever heard. It was a plan built on memory, on touch, on the things that paper could not capture. Kerr's men are in town. Bly's men are in Sable. They'll be watching us. Then we go tonight, Mara said. And we go where they won't look. The rain began just as they reached the edge of Willow Trace, a thin, cold drizzle that was more mist than water. But by the time they slipped through the shadows behind the blacksmith's shop, it had turned into a steady, determined downpour. The world dissolved into the sound of water on wood, on mud, on leaves. A blessing, a voice whispered from the darkness of the seamstress's back porch. Mother Taft was waiting for them, a dark shawl wrapped around her head and shoulders. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she stood as straight as one of her own darning needles. She held a canvas sack and a hickory walking stick. "The mud will be deep," Coulter said, his voice low as he helped her down the single step. "The world has been mud since I was born. Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice surprisingly strong. "I've learned where to put my feet." Mara took the older woman's other arm. Mother Taft's hand, wrinkled and crisscrossed with 1,000 tiny scars from her needle, gripped Mara's forearm. The grip was firm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Your mother's girl," she murmured. A statement, not a question. "You have her bones." They moved as 3 shadows, keeping to the alleys, avoiding the main street. Coulter led, his long strides shortened to match their pace. He seemed to have a map of the darkness in his head, moving from one pool of shadow to the next. The rain was their ally. It drove any sensible person indoors and turned the dry, dusty paths into sucking mud that muffled their footsteps. From the creek basin, a new sound rose to meet the rain, the deafening chorus of 1,000 bullfrogs, their deep, throaty calls vibrating in the wet air. The sound was a wall, a thick blanket that covered any noise they might make. They were halfway to the Delaney property, following the low ground of the creek bed. When the sound came, it was faint at first, a high-toned clang that cut through the bass of the frogs and the hiss of the rain. Mara stopped, her head snapping up toward the town. "No!" Coulter's hand on her arm steadied her. He was already listening. It came again. Clang, clang, clang. The church bell. But it wasn't the frantic, ragged sound of the other night. This was measured. 3 rings. A pause. 3 rings. A pause. A signal. "He knows," Mara whispered, her voice tight with panic. "He's not at prayer." "He's calling his hounds," Coulter said, his voice grim. "He's found you gone from the shack, or he's just checking his fences. It doesn't matter. We move faster." "The light," Mother Taft said, her voice calm. "He will expect us to be blind. We must not be." Coulter unslung the small pack he carried. From it, he pulled a storm lantern, but he did not light it. He also pulled a large square of oiled canvas. He wrapped the canvas around the lantern's globe, securing it with a length of twine, leaving only a small, fist-sized opening on one side. "It won't throw light far," he said. "Just at our feet. Let's go." They reached the stand of cottonwoods that marked the Delaney line. The rain was a deluge now, a solid, silver sheet of water. "This is the dry wash," Mara said, her voice strained. And there it was, a fresh, ugly pile of stones, stacked high and marked with a raw, new-cut pine stake. The ground around it was torn up from digging, the mud already turning to soup. "This is a lie," Mother Taft said. She hadn't even reached for it. She just stood, her face angled, reading the air. "The air is wrong. It smells of dust and lime. The creek is the other way. I smell the damp rot. The true bank." She tugged on Mara's arm. "Lead me to the lightning tree, child. The one your mother called the old man." They pushed on. Another 500 yards, deeper into the trees. the ground becoming soft and spongy. "Here," Mara said, stopping at the base of a truly massive, split-trunk sycamore. Coulter lit the lantern inside his pack, the light emerging from the oilcloth shield as a single, weak, yellow beam. He directed it at the ground. There, nearly swallowed by overgrown brush and a decade of fallen leaves, was a small, low cairn of rocks. Mother Taft let go of Mara's arm. She knelt, her movement stiff but certain. She put her hands on the rocks. She did not tap them. She splayed her fingers, her palms flat, reading the stones as Mara had read her mother's journal. Her hands moved over the surfaces, feeling the texture, the deep-seated chill, the vegetation. "Here," she whispered, her fingers tracing a patch of dark green. "This is old moss. This is 10-year moss. This is velvet. The other, that was just slime." Her hand moved from the stone to the base of the tree. Her fingers, spiders of incredible sensitivity, explored the damp bark. "And here," she said, her voice full of a quiet, hard discovery. "The blaze." Coulter moved the beam of light. There, just as the journal had said, was the old, healed-over scar of an axe cut, 10 paces from the marker. "This is the place," Mother Taft declared. "This is marker number 3. The other is a sin. Then we move the sin." Coulter said. He set the lantern down, the beam pointing at the false marker. He unwound the lariat from his saddle, which he had left tied in a dense thicket. He tied one end around the pine stake. "When I pull, you guide the rocks," he said to Mara. He dug his heels into the mud and pulled. The stake came free with a wet, sucking sound. The rocks, poorly stacked, tumbled into the wash. "This is not enough," Mara said. "They will just put it back." "No," Coulter said. "We bring the true marker here. We bring the stone from the sycamore." "It's too heavy," Mara said, her heart sinking. "The sin is heavy." Coulter replied, "This is just rock." He took his rope. He tied it around the largest, foundational stone of the true marker. He found a thick, fallen cottonwood branch and worked it under the stone as a lever. "Mara, hold the light. Mother Taft, please, stand back by the tree." "I am not glass, boy," the old woman said. But she moved back. Coulter put all his weight on the lever. The rock did not budge. "It's set too deep," he grunted. "Wait," Mara said. She directed the light at the base. "It's not just set. Look," she pointed. There, carved into the side of the stone, just at the mud line, was a small, intricate shape, a capital D, with a single, straight line drawn through it. The Delaney touch mark. "They didn't just move a pile of rocks," Mara breathed, her voice full of a new horror. "They stole my father's marker stone." At that exact moment, they heard it, the click of a horseshoe on stone. Up on the ridge, Coulter moved instantly. His hand clamped over the top of the lantern, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Don't move! Muscle!" His whisper was so low it was barely a vibration in the air. They froze. The rain and the frogs were a roar. But now, beneath it, came the new sounds. The jingle of a harness, the creak of wet leather. A low, annoyed curse from a man. "Told you, Kerr was jumpy. Ain't nothing out here but mud and frogs. Shut up and ride the line. He wants the wash checked. He said Bly's men were here today." Torchlight. It appeared suddenly on the ridge above them, a smeared orange wound in the black and silver rain. Mara's breath stopped in her throat. Mother Taft was a dark shape, leaning against the sycamore, but they were out in the open, not 30 yards from the wash. The torchlight began to move, descending the slick path toward them. "I see the wash," the man called. "And I see the marker Kerr set. It's fine. Let's get back to the whiskey." "Hold up!" The second rider. His voice was harder. "Let me look. Get down." The lights. There were 2, bobbed and swayed as the men dismounted. Mara could smell the resin of their pine torches, a sharp, stinging scent that cut through the clean smell of the rain. She did not know she had moved until she felt the rough bark of the sycamore at her back. She had placed herself, small as she was, directly in front of Mother Taft. Her body was a shield. She was trembling, not from cold, but from a white-hot, protective rage. Her eyes were wide in the dark, fixed on the approaching, monstrous shadows the torches cast. She did not blink, she just stared, her hands clenched at her sides, as if she could will them away. The men, 3 of them, reached the false marker. They were silhouettes, their hats and shoulders slick with rain. "See, it's here," the first man said. Just like he said, pile of rocks. "It looks smaller," the second man said, holding his torch low. "This mud, it's all torn up. We're in a damn flash flood, you idiot. Of course it's torn up. What's that?" He pointed his torch. The beam of light, weak and flickering, slid across the mud, catching the long, deep drag mark from the pine stake Coulter had pulled. "What is that?" the second man said again, his voice now sharp. He took a step toward the darkness, toward the sycamore, in the blackness. Coulter's hand found a loose rock. He did not throw it. He tossed it, a short, high arc, away from them, up the creek bed. It landed with a loud sploosh in a deep pool of water. "What the hell?" the first man yelped, spinning, his pistol suddenly in his hand. "Just a beaver," the second man growled, but he sounded unsure. "Or a coon, or that rancher." The third man, who hadn't spoken, said, "Kerr said he was poison." They stood there for a long, agonizing minute. The rain poured down, hissing on their torches. "It's mud," the second man finally said, his authority returning. "It's all mud. The marker's there. I'm not standing in this flood for Kerr's ghosts. Let's go." They turned. The torches moved away, climbing the ridge. Mara and Coulter watched until the lights were just 2 faint, orange stars. And then they were gone. No one spoke. Coulter let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since they arrived. "Now," he said. He lit the lantern again. The world snapped back into yellow. Wet focus. "We don't move the stone," he said, his voice urgent. "We don't have time." He went to the false marker. He took the heavy stones, one by one, and began carrying them to the sycamore, placing them on top of the true marker, the one with the Delaney D. "Mara, help me. We build this one high. We make it look like it's been here forever." They worked in a frantic, desperate silence. They packed mud and leaves between the stones. They brought moss from the tree and pressed it into the cracks. In 10 minutes, they had built a tall, solid cairn, with the Delaney marker stone as its immovable, secret heart. Coulter then took the pine stake, waded into the fast-moving wash, and jammed it deep into the mud, where the current would take it by morning. He stood back, breathing hard, the rain plastering his hair to his head. "It's done." He pulled his new notebook from his oilskin pouch. It was damp, but the pages were dry. With a pencil, he sketched the scene, his hand moving with surprising speed. The sycamore, the repaired cairn, the distance to the creek. The X for the blaze on the bark. "No harm in being careful," he muttered. He offered his arm to Mother Taft. "Ma'am, let's get you home." On the walk back, the tension was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-grinding exhaustion. They were a mile from the line shack when Coulter stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, bone-handled folding knife. It was worn, but the blade, when he opened it, was sharp and clean. He held it out to Mara. She looked at it, confused. "It's for cutting rope," he said, his voice flat. "Not for cutting men, but you need something. A tool, not a weapon." She took it. The bone handle was smooth, warmed by his pocket. She closed her hand around it. "For rope," she repeated. They reached the porch of the line shack. The new oak bar he had carved was propped by the door. The rain was finally easing, but they were soaked to the skin, their clothes weighing them down. They stood on the narrow porch, water dripping from the brim of Coulter's hat, from Mara's hair, from the hem of Mother Taft's shawl. They were so close. They could feel the heat radiating from each other's bodies, a small, steaming pocket of life in the cold, wet night. Mara could see the pulse beating in Coulter's throat, hear the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing, but the space between them was a mile wide, It was the space of propriety, of danger, of the unsaid things. "We're soaked," Mara said, her voice sounding thin and strange. "We are," Coulter agreed. He pushed the door open, to the warmth and the smell of dry wood. And the nights next, long watch. The rain had stopped, but the peace it left was a lie. The wind, which had quieted to a whisper, turned. It swung around from the north, and it came back not with water, but with the high plains themselves. It was a dry, scouring sound, a high-pitched scream that carried the grit of 1,000 miles of badlands. A new sound began, the sharp, irregular tack-tack-tack of sand and small pebbles hitting the cabin's single window. The tin roof, which had drummed under the rain, now groaned and shrieked as the wind tried to peel it from its rafters. Coulter had taken Mother Taft home hours ago, a perilous journey through the last of the rain, and had returned to find Mara exactly where he had left her, sitting on the stool, staring at the stove. Now, they were prisoners. The cabin was a tiny, dim-lit box, and the world outside was a howling, red-brown void. Dust found its way through every crack, and the chinking of the logs, under the door. The air grew thick with it, and the light from the hurricane lamp on the table became a hazy, amber cone. Coulter stood by the door, his hand resting on the new oak bar, listening, not for men, this time, but for the storm. He was calculating the roof's chances, the mule's safety in the lean-to. Mara sat by the fire. She had changed out of her sodden clothes into a set of his late wife's, which he had silently laid on the cot for her. A simple wool skirt and a homespun shirt, too large in the shoulders, but dry. She was still cold. The wetness had gone into her bones, and the storm's dry fury seemed to leach the warmth from the air. A shiver, violent and uncontrollable, seized her. Her teeth chattered, a sound that was, for a moment, louder than the wind. Coulter turned. He saw her, huddled on the stool, her hands clamped in her armpits, her whole body shaking. He said nothing. He went to the rough-hewn wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He lifted the lid, and the scent of cedar and old wool filled the small space. He pulled out a thick, heavy blanket, dark blue, the letters "Use" stamped in one corner. An old army blanket, built for weather worse than this. He walked to her. She looked up, her eyes wide, startled by his sudden movement. He unfolded the blanket. He went to drape it over her shoulders. And then he stopped. His hands, holding the heavy wool, hovered inches from her. His knuckles were scarred, his fingers thick with calluses. He was close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. The pause was a question. It was a tangible thing, a space he would not cross without her leave. He was not Reverend Kerr, to grab and hold. He was not a man who took. He was asking, without a single word, if he could offer this small, physical comfort. Mara looked at his hands, then at his face. His expression was unreadable in the poor light, his eyes in shadow. But his stillness, his hesitation, was the most profound respect she had ever been shown. She gave a small, jerky nod. His hands moved, laying the heavy wool across her shoulders. He was careful, his touch brief, almost impersonal, but his fingers brushed the damp hair at her neck. He tucked the blanket around her, sealing her in its warmth. He stepped back. He took the other stool, the one he had used the first night, and sat opposite her. The distance was no more than an arm's length. The tiny, storm-racked cabin was their whole world. The wind screamed, and the roof rattled. But between them, the fire in the stove's small grate cast a pool of warm, amber light. It danced on his high cheekbones, on the line of her jaw. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the world try to tear itself apart. "You should try to sleep," he said finally, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. "You say that," she replied, her voice muffled by the wool. "But you do not." He looked at her, surprised. "I hear you," she said. "The first night, and last night, you are by the door, or mending harness when it is still dark. You do not sleep." Coulter looked away, toward the fire. The small iron grate was a fiery, winking eye. He thought of Ellen, He thought of the long nights after she was gone, when silence was so loud it was a kind of madness. He had welcomed the work, he had welcomed the exhaustion, but sleep, true sleep, had never really returned. "It doesn't hold," he said, the admission costing him. "I know," she whispered, and her voice was so full of understanding it made his throat tighten. "I know about the nights, the ones where you lie still and listen. You listen for the next thing that is coming to be taken. You watch the dark and you just wait." He looked at her, truly seeing the depth of the exhaustion in her face. She was not just tired from the ride, from the fear. She was tired in her soul, in the way he was. They were two watchers, two guards on empty walls. His hand was resting on his knee, the fist clenching and unclenching, a rhythm of tension he was not even aware of. It was a big, rough hand, the hand that had sketched her mother's map, that had reset her father's stone, the hand that had held a gun to guard her. Mara watched it. She saw the tension in it. And in that moment, the barrier of fear, of propriety, of the sheer raw strangeness of their situation, just dissolved. She was moved by a simple, human need to bridge the small, cold distance between them. To say thank you, to say, "I see you." Slowly, she unwrapped one hand from the warm cocoon of the blanket. She reached across the space, her hand pale in the firelight. She laid her palm, very lightly, on the back of his clenched fist. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing. A test. Coulter went absolutely still. He looked down, her small, slender hand on his. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. He could feel the impossible, shocking softness of her skin against his knuckles. He had not been touched with simple kindness in years. He did not know what to do with it. His first instinct, the instinct of the solitary man, was to pull back, to break the contact, to return to the safety of his own space. He did not. He fought the instinct. He made himself be still. And then, very, very slowly, he uncurled his fist. He turned his hand over, palm up, until his rough, calloused skin met the new, terrifying softness of hers. He did not grab her hand. He simply let it rest there. Then, just as slowly, he closed his fingers, lacing them with hers. His hand was huge, warm, and strong. It enveloped hers completely. He held it. The contact was a shock to them both, a deep, slow heating current that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the fact that they were a man and a woman, alive, in a small room, while the world was ending outside. He looked up from their joined hands, his eyes finding hers. She was watching him, her lips parted, her breath caught. He leaned forward, just an inch. The movement was a question. She did not pull away. She leaned in, her eyes never leaving his. Their knees touched. He could feel her breath on his face. Warm, faintly sweet. She could smell the wood smoke on his skin. A clean, sharp scent. Their foreheads were almost touching. The world, the wind, the roof, the danger. It all collapsed into the few, breathless inches between their faces. "Mara," he breathed, her name more a statement than a question. She answered by closing her eyes. He closed the final distance. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of demand. It was not the desperate, grabbing kiss of a lonely man. It was, first, just a touch, a press of warmth, a question, a promise. It was a kiss that said, "I will not hurt you. You're safe here." It was unhurried, deep, and slow. Her lips were chapped, and she tasted of dust and fear, but she was warm. She responded, a small, hesitant parting of her lips, a breath of a sigh that he felt more than heard. It was a kiss of gratitude, of yielding, of a vulnerability so profound it made his heart ache. He let go of her hand. His hand, the one that had held hers, came up to her face. He cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing over the curve of her cheekbone. His other hand went to her shoulder, finding the warm wool of the blanket, the heavy army blanket, his last shield. Slipped. He pushed it back, and it fell, pooling on the stool. His greatcoat, which she had still been wearing beneath it, followed, sliding from her two large shoulders and landing on the floor with a soft, heavy sound. She was left in his wife's simple, gray shirt. A shiver ran through her, a quick, sudden tremor, but it was not from the cold. He pulled her, gently. She stood, and he rose with her, pulling her into the space between his knees. She came without resistance, her hands landing on his chest, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt. He held her. His arms went around her, one hand splayed wide across the small of her back, pressing her to him, the other hand at her nape, his fingers tangling in the thick, unbound silk of her hair. It was the first time he had truly held her. She was small and fine-boned, but she felt solid. She felt real. He lowered his head again, and this kiss was different. It was deeper, surer. It was a kiss of recognition. The fire in the stove ticked and cracked, the light lashing their faces. The wind screamed, a jealous, lonely sound. The shadows on the log wall, cast by the single, shuddering lantern, merged. They were no longer two separate, watching figures, but one dark, moving shape. The cabin door remained barred. The little brass bell on the latch was silent. The fire settled into a deep, pulsing bed of amber coals. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, in the small, warm heart of it, there was a profound and absolute stillness. When the first pale gray light of dawn broke through the haze, the storm was over. The world outside was quiet, blanketed in a fine layer of red dust. The cabin was cold. The fire had died. Coulter was already standing by the stove, his back to the cot, his coat on. He was building a new fire, the scrape of wood on iron the only sound. On the cot, Mara was awake. She was dressed. She sat up, pulling the heavy army blanket around her. It was neatly draped over her, though she had no memory of pulling it up. He heard the rustle of the mattress. He did not turn. He kept feeding kindling into the stove. "The storm has passed," he said. "Yes," she said. The air was thick with the unsaid, with the memory of the night, with the new, fragile, terrifying thing that sat between them. He got the fire lit and put the coffee pot on. Only then did he turn. He looked at her. She was sitting on the cot, her hair a wild, beautiful mess, her face pale. She looked like a refugee, but her eyes were steady. There was no language for what had happened. There were no promises asked for, none given. There was only the shared, undeniable fact of it. She met his gaze. Her eyes were not afraid. They were not the eyes of the girl on the church steps. They were clear, and in them, he saw a deep, quiet, and unmistakable gratitude. She gave a small nod, a simple acknowledgement. He nodded back, a single, sharp dip of his chin. "We are on the same side." She stood and went to the water barrel, to the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging on a nail. She saw her reflection, this wild-looking woman in a borrowed shirt. She began to braid her hair, her fingers working with a new, determined purpose. She needed to tie it. On the nail next to the mirror was his neckerchief, the dark blue cotton square he had worn on the ride to Sable. She looked at his reflection in the mirror. He was watching her. A silent question passed between them. He turned back to the stove, giving her his back. Permission. She took the kerchief. She finished the thick, dark braid and tied it at the base of her neck. The dark blue cloth was a stark, bright flag against the pale gray of the shirt. It was an answer, an alliance. She turned from the mirror, her face set, her armor on. "What?" she said, her voice clear and strong in the morning quiet. "Is next." The bell of St. Bartram's began to toll at 8 o'clock in the morning. This was not the frantic, broken alarm of Mara's escape, nor the measured summons for Sunday worship. This was a heavy, slow, funereal beat. It was a sound of judgment. It was a sound that pulled people from their homes, their shops, their chores, their faces tight with a mixture of dread and hungry curiosity. By 9 o'clock, the church was full, but it was not a congregation. It was an audience. Reverend Silas Kerr stood on the steps, his face a mask of profound, tragic sorrow. He had branded his flock, and now he would brand the stray. My friends, my neighbors. His voice, stripped of its honey, was now the raw, powerful instrument of a field preacher. A great sickness has come among us, a child of this church. A lamb I raised as my own has been led astray. He pointed, not at anyone, but at the sky, at the high mesas. She has been taken from the path of righteousness. She has been corrupted by a man of no God. A man of violence and solitude, she has become unclean. A gasp rippled through the crowd. She has shown herself to be ungrateful. He boomed. Rebellious and unfit to manage her own affairs. Her mother's legacy, a sacred trust, is in peril from her own unguided, childish, and impure hands. He was painting Mara as a harlot, Coulter as a despoiler. He was using the oldest weapons in his arsenal, shame and fear. And so, he continued, his voice dropping, by the authority of this county, Judge Trammell has convened a hearing. This day, this hour, we must, for her own protection, assign a legal guardian. We must, as a community, save this child from herself. We must save her inheritance from her own folly. He was not asking for a wedding. He was asking for a forced guardianship. He was asking for the legal right to sign her name, to sell her land, to erase her. The crowd, caught in the grip of his performance, murmured their assent. It was a moral imperative. The church doors were thrown open. Inside, the pulpit had been pushed to the side. In its place, at the front of the nave, was a heavy oak table. Judge Obadiah Trammell sat behind it, his face grim and official. A stack of blank papers and an inkwell before him. This was not a church. It was a courtroom. Horace Bly, the railroad man, sat in the front pew, his hands folded on his cane, looking more like an investor watching a foregone auction than a witness. 3 of his men, the same hard-faced gunmen Coulter had seen in Sable, stood at the back, by the doors. They were a visible, silent threat. The crowd pressed in, filling the pews. The air grew hot, smelling of damp wool, sweat, and the faint, lingering scent of old incense. Trammell banged a heavy wooden gavel on the table. This hearing is convened in the matter of the guardianship of Mara Delaney. The Reverend Kerr, as her current executor, has petitioned this court. He was about to continue, to steamroll the entire proceeding, when the main doors at the back of the church opened. The noise of the room died. Every head turned. Mara Delaney stood in the doorway. She was not the wild, terrified creature who had huddled on the steps. She was not the soot-stained woman from the line shack. The borrowed wool skirt was clean. The gray shirt was neatly tucked. Her hair was pulled back in a single, tight braid, and tied at the nape of her neck was Coulter Vance's dark blue kerchief. Her back was straight. Her head was high. She held a canvas-bound journal in one hand and a small, folded paper in the other. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Judge Trammell, behind her. Coulter Vance stepped into the church. He wore his sheepskin-lined coat, his hat in his hand. He did not follow her down the aisle. He simply moved to the nearest thick support pillar, leaned his shoulder against it, and crossed his arms. He became, as he had been on the steps, a silent, unmovable fact, as still and as patient as stone. Mara walked down the aisle. The whispers followed her like a tide. Look at her, bold as brass. That's his kerchief. Lord have mercy. She stopped, not before the table, but to the side, near the witness stand. Judge Trammell, she said, her voice clear. It did not shake. You are holding a hearing about me. I am here. Trammell's face flushed a deep, angry red. This is irregular. Miss Delaney, this is a matter for your executor. You are a party to be discussed, not a party to the discussion. I am the landholder, Mara said, and I am of sound mind, and I contest this hearing. On what grounds? Trammell sneered. On the grounds that you fled a lawful wedding contract and shacked up with a... He glanced at Coulter. A rancher. On the grounds that there was no lawful contract, Mara said. There was only a crime. Kerr shot to his feet. Lies. She is deluded, Judge. She is clearly unfit. I have proof, Mara said, her voice cutting through his. She held up the journal. I have my mother's words. She opened the journal to the marked page. Boundary marker number 3, set by the lightning-struck sycamore, 10 paces west from the blaze, signed, Eleanor Delaney. She then held up the second paper, the sketch Coulter had made, and this is a map of where that marker sits today, built high and true by the sycamore, just as my mother wrote. A child's drawing a diary, Trammell scoffed, waving his hand. That is not a legal plat, girl. It means nothing. Then perhaps, a new voice said from the aisle, a witness means something. Mother Taft, her hand on the arm of the blacksmith, began to walk slowly forward. This is a circus, Kerr yelled. An old, blind woman. What can she say? Mother Taft reached the front. She did not look at Trammell. She faced Kerr. I can say, she said, her voice frail but carrying in the rapt silence, that my hands are not blind. Silas Kerr, I can say that I put my hands on the false marker in the dry wash, and the moss was new, and the rock was fractured, and I put my hands on the true marker, by the sycamore, and the moss was as old as my own skin. I can say that I felt the Delaney touch mark, cut into the stone, where it has sat for 20 years. She turned to the pews. I delivered that girl's mother. I buried her. I know the feel of that land, and this man, she pointed a gnarled finger at Kerr, is a liar. The church erupted. Trammell hammered his gavel. Order, order. This is sentiment. It is not evidence. It is not proof. Then perhaps, a third voice said, sharp and reedy, the Sable County Registry is proof. The crowd parted again. Mrs. Agatha Lindell stood there, holding 2 massive, leather-bound ledgers. She was pale, but her chin was high. She walked to the table and, with a loud thump, dropped the ledgers in front of Judge Trammell. What is this? Agatha, Trammell said, his voice suddenly uncertain. This, Mrs., Lindell said, opening the first book, her fingers tracing a line, is the Sable County Deed Registry, Volume 4, page 211, the Delaney deed, filed in 1865, and this, she opened the second, is the Water Rights Registry, Volume 2, page 88, the Delaney Survey, hand-drawn by Eleanor Delaney, filed in 1877, both stamped and sealed by your predecessor, Judge Harrison. May he rest in peace. She looked up, her thick spectacles reflecting the light. These documents, which predate Reverend Kerr's arrival in this territory by more than a decade. Note the boundary marker at the sycamore. Your entire petition, Judge, is based on a false line. The railroad plat is based on a false line. Horace Bly, in the front pew, leaned forward, his knuckles white on his cane. Kerr was ashen. He saw it all slipping away. He lunged at the journal in Mara's hand. This is the forgery. This is the lies she and her brute. They concocted this. They drew this map. The real marker, the one my men repaired, is by the wash. The line is clear. It is. It is where the sun sets in the east. He stopped, his own words hanging in the dead. Silent air. No one moved. Then, from the front pew, a farmer, a man who had fought the High Plains sun for 30 years, let out a short, harsh laugh. Sets in the east. Does it, Reverend? He called out. That's some new gospel you're preaching, because my corn seems to think it sets in the west. A wave of laughter, low and dangerous, rolled through the church. Kerr's face, already pale, turned a mottled, sick gray. He had, in his desperation, exposed his own ignorance of the very land he was trying to steal. He had proven he was a stranger. Trammell saw the room turning. He saw the jury of the pews find its verdict. He slammed his gavel, his face slick with sweat. This is chaos. This is not a court of law, the word of an addled woman, a forged diary, and a senile clerk. It is insufficient, I find the petition for guardianship. Valid. The matter is closed. He was moving to sign the paper. No, the voice did not come from the front. It came from the back. It was not loud, but it filled the entire church, cutting through the noise, the panic, The gavel. Coulter Vance pushed himself off the pillar. He had not moved an inch until now. He began to walk, his steps slow, measured, the sound of his worn boot heels on the wooden floor the only sound. He walked down the aisle, his eyes locked on Judge Trammell. The crowd parted for him. He did not stop at the witness stand. He walked right up to the table, placed his hands, palm down, on Trammell's desk, and leaned forward. "You can't sign that paper. Judge!" "Get back, sir," Trammell blustered, pushing his chair back. "You have no standing here. You will be held in contempt." "You've heard from the paper," Coulter said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You've heard from the people. You've even heard from the man who thinks the sun rises in the wrong place." He inclined his head at Kerr. "But you haven't heard from the land, and you haven't heard from the water." He stood up straight. "This hearing isn't over. We ask for a recess. We need 12 hours. We have one more witness to call." Trammell, trapped between Coulter's physical presence and the angry, suspicious eyes of the entire town, had no choice. "This is absurd. Who else could you possibly call to this circus?" Coulter turned. He looked at Mara, a quick, steadying glance. Then he looked at the crowd. The river. The word dropped into the church like a stone. Whispers erupted. "What's he mean? The river! Has he gone mad? The river!" Coulter said, his voice silencing them again. "Mrs. Taft is right. Mrs. Lindell is right. This journal is right. The true Delaney marker, the one with the D on it, sits at the high water line of Sedgewater Creek. The false marker, the one Reverend Kerr built, sits 20 feet above it in a dry wash." He pointed to the farmer who had laughed. "You know the high plains melt. Mr. Abernathy, it's coming down now. The creek is rising." He turned back to Trammell. "We will all meet at the creek, noon tomorrow. The water itself will be the witness. It will show you where the true line is. It will show you who is lying." It was a brilliant, simple, frontier-perfect test. It took the law out of Trammell's corrupt hands and put it in the hands of nature. The crowd loved it. "Let the river decide," someone yelled. Trammell, his face purple, was trapped. If he refused, he was admitting his guilt. "Fine," he shouted, banging the gavel. "Fine noon tomorrow at the Sedgewater crossing, and that," his eyes were murderous, "will be the end of this. This hearing is recessed." Kerr was shaking with a rage so profound he could not speak. He looked at Horace Bly. The railroad man had not moved, but his face was calm, cold, and calculating. He watched Coulter and Mara leave the church, followed by Mother Taft and Mrs. Lindell. Then Bly stood, adjusted his cravat, and nodded. Once, to his 3 men at the back. They nodded in return and slipped out the side door. They were not heading to the saloon. They were heading to the cottonwoods that lined Sedgewater Creek. The sun was a hammer, beating down from a cloudless, metallic sky. It was exactly noon. The air at Sedgewater Creek was thick, not just with heat, but with the weight of almost the entire town of Willow Trace. They lined the muddy banks, a silent, grim jury, their Sunday clothes standing out in the harsh, wild landscape. On one side, near the dry wash, stood Judge Trammell, Reverend Kerr, and Horace Bly. Their confidence was a palpable thing, an armor of assumed authority. On the other, by the lightning-struck sycamore, stood Mara, Coulter, Mother Taft, and Mrs. Lindell, driven deep into the creek bed. Right beside the tall, mossy cairn they had rebuilt was a long, freshly cut pine plank. It was Coulter's work, the product of a sleepless night. He had spent hours with his knife, carving a series of deep, horizontal notches into the wood. It was a miner's gauge, simple, honest, and clear. In his hand, he held Eleanor Delaney's journal. Open to the page with the water level chart, Judge Trammell, sweating in his black coat, pounded the sycamore's trunk with his gavel. "Noon, the appointed hour. Mr. Vance, this court is unimpressed by your theatrics. You have called the river as a witness. Let it speak, or let us be done with this nonsense." Coulter did not look at the judge. He looked at the crowd. "This," he said, his voice carrying in the still air, "is the Delaney line." He slapped the tall stone cairn, set by her father, recorded by her mother, and this, he pointed up the hill to the false marker in the dry wash, "is Reverend Kerr's line, a lie, set high and dry, 20 feet above the water." "Slander," Kerr shouted. "That marker has been there for a year. It is the true line." "The river is rising," Coulter said, ignoring him. "The snowmelt is coming down from the high country, but it's not fast enough. It seems someone has been helping the land lie." He turned and waded into the creek. The water was only knee-deep, moving sluggishly. He walked upstream, past the sycamore, into a thicket of cottonwoods. The crowd murmured, confused, and began to follow. Mara, her heart pounding, plunged into the water after him. They came to a narrow bend. There, jammed between the banks, was a crude, temporary dam of rocks, mud, and freshly cut logs. It was a clear diversion, choking the main flow of the Sedgewater, forcing more than half its volume into an old, dry irrigation ditch. "Bly's men," Coulter said, loud enough for all to hear. "They've been strangling the creek, trying to prove the Reverend's lie was true, trying to hide the water." He pulled a long, heavy fence post he had stashed in the brush and jammed it into the center of the dam. "Mara, your land, your water." She grabbed another post. They wedged them against the key log. "Now," he grunted. They threw their combined weight against the levers. For a moment, nothing. Then, a sharp crack of wood, a groan of shifting rock. The dam broke, with a deep, guttural roar. The full, liberated power of the Sedgewater Creek surged forward. A wall of cold, dark snowmelt, freed from its prison, tore down the creek bed. The crowd screamed and scrambled back up the banks. The water hit the crossing. It was no longer a lazy creek. It was a river. It tore at the banks, a brown, churning, angry thing. It rose, swallowing the mud flats. It climbed the banks. Coulter was already back at his gauge, standing on the bank as the water surged around its base. The water rose, climbing the notched plank. It passed the first mark, the second. It kept climbing. The crowd was dead silent. The water swirled, deepened, and then held, its powerful current lapping exactly at the fourth and highest notch Coulter had carved. He held up the Delaney Journal, his hand steady. "The High Spring Melt Line," he roared over the sound of the water. "Recorded by Eleanor Delaney, May 4th, 1877. The river is exactly where she said it would be." He pointed to the tall stone cairn, its base now completely submerged in the fast, deep water. The Delaney marker set at the high water line where it has always been. Then he turned, his arm sweeping up the hill to the false marker, sitting ridiculous and alone in its dry wash. "And that is the lie." The proof was absolute. It was visceral. It was nature itself testifying. Mother Taft, her face serene, walked to the edge of the new, strong bank. She knelt, guided by Mrs. Lindell, and dipped her hand into the surging, cold current. A small smile touched her lips. "Water always comes home," she said, her quiet voice seeming to cut through the roar. "It always returns to its habit. This is the Sedgewater. It has come home." A single sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the cottonwoods on the far bank. A puff of mud exploded at Coulter's feet. The crowd screamed, panicking, turning to run. Coulter did not move. He did not draw his gun. He did not even look at his feet. He turned his face toward the hidden gunman and he roared. A sound of pure, primal fury that silenced the crowd and the river. "You can't shoot the river. You can't shoot the truth. Are you going to shoot all of us? Shoot the whole town?" His question hung in the air. A standoff. Then Mr. Abernathy, the farmer, his face set like iron, stepped forward. He walked down the bank and stood next to Coulter, then the blacksmith, then two more men, then three, in a wave of silent, grim decision. The men of the jury pews, the men who understood land and water, surged forward. They formed a human wall, their backs to the gunmen, their faces turned to Trammell and Kerr. "The river has spoken. Judge," Abernathy said, "we've seen enough." Silas Kerr saw it all disintegrate. The land, the money, the authority, his entire constructed life. His mask of pastoral piety did not slip. It shattered. "No!" he shrieked, his voice a high, thin tear in the air. "It's a trick, a devil's trick." He saw one of Bly's gunmen on the bank, his hand on his holstered pistol. Kerr's sanity snapped. He lunged, his hand clawing, and grabbed the gun from the man's holster. He was a preacher, not a gunman. He fumbled the heavy iron, his fingers slipping on the handle. He tried to raise it, to point it at Coulter, at Mara, at the water itself. He spun wildly, stumbling in the slick mud. A wet, sickening pop echoed by the water. Kerr screamed. It was not a roar of rage, but a thin, high animal sound of pure agony. He fell, writhing, clutching his arm. The gun flew from his useless fingers and disappeared into the churning water. He had dislocated his own shoulder. The reverend, the shepherd of the flock, was a screaming, disarmed man, weeping in the mud of the land he had tried to steal. The standoff was broken. A slow, rhythmic clapping came from the back of the crowd. Horace Bly stepped forward. He was untouched, his suit clean, his face a mask of amused, patrician condescension. "Well," he said, his voice easily carrying. That was quite the performance, quite the rural drama. He walked down to the bank, ignoring the pathetic Kerr, ignoring Coulter. He stopped in front of Mara. "Miss Delaney," he said, smiling. "It seems there has been a significant misunderstanding, a clerical error." He gestured to the land. "My railroad requires this crossing. I am prepared to offer you significant compensation, a generous amount, I assure you. Let us name a price. Say $1,000, in gold." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a staggering sum. Mara looked at the surging, free river. She looked at the broken, weeping man in the mud. Then she looked at the smiling man offering her a bribe. "Compensation?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it was as sharp and cold as the river water. "Compensation for what? Mister, Bly for my land, or for the person you tried to sell along with it?" Bly's smile faltered. "Judge," Coulter's voice was a blade. Trammell, who had been trying to edge away, froze. "This hearing is still in session. Get your book." The crowd turned. A single, menacing body. Toward Trammell. He had no choice. He fumbled for his ledger, his hands shaking. "Right," Coulter commanded. "The petition for guardianship is denied. The claims of Reverend Silas Kerr are found to be fraudulent." "I cannot," Trammell protested. "Write it," Abernathy growled. Stepping toward him, Trammell wrote. "Further," Coulter said, "Miss Delaney wishes to make a final disposition of her land, to protect it." Mara looked at him, startled. He met her gaze. "Trust me." Coulter turned to the crowd. "The Delaney lands and all the pertinent water rights are to be placed, effective immediately, into a community trust." "What?" Bly snapped, his face finally losing its composure, turning dark. "A trust," Coulter repeated. "To be administered by a board for the good and prosperity of Willow Trace. That board will be Mrs. Agatha Lindell, Mother Elara Taft, and Mrs. Beth Abernathy." The women in the crowd, silent for so long, let out a unified, stunned sound. "Miss Delaney's right to live on, work, and profit from her family homestead," Coulter finished, his voice ringing, "is to be held in reserve for her, and for her heirs, in perpetuity. But the disposition of any and all water rights, or railroad rights of way, will be decided by that board, by the women of this town." It was a masterstroke. He had protected Mara from Bly, from Kerr, from any man who ever came after. He had put the land's power into the hands of the three women they could not bribe, bully, or break. Coulter looked at Trammell. "The men of this town have seen the truth. Do you wish to defy them? Judge." Trammell looked at the hard, unyielding faces of the farmers, the blacksmith, the jury of his peers. He looked at their wives, who were now the most powerful landowners in the county. He was beaten, So recorded, he spat, signing the page with a vicious, angry scratch. Kerr was hauled to his feet, his face a mask of sweat, mud, and pure, unholy hatred. As his men dragged him away, his eyes met Coulter's. He leaned toward one of his men, his lips moving. He was too far to hear, but his whisper was clear in the bright sun. "Ash Mesa. Tonight. Burn it all." The crowd began to cheer, the tension breaking into a celebration. Mara stood by the bank, watching her river, her water, running free and strong. Coulter came to stand beside her. The sun was still high. The fight was won, but the war was not. He looked at her, his face grim. "It's time we go watch our own fire." The smell came first, just after midnight. It was not the clean scent of pine smoke from their own stove. It was the greasy, acrid smell of old hay and dry timber catching fire. Mara was not asleep. She was sitting at the small table, cleaning the shotgun. The small, bone-handled knife Coulter had given her resting beside her. Coulter was on the porch, a dark shape against the starlit sky, his rifle across his knees. They had been waiting. "Coulter," she said, her voice low. "I smell it," he answered. He was already on his feet, moving not toward the smell, but toward the small rise behind the shack. He crested the small hill and stopped. Below them, perhaps a quarter-mile away, his hay barn was a column of orange and red, a terrible, roaring flower blooming in the darkness. Mara came up beside him, the shotgun in her hands. "The horses! The mule!" "Move them," Coulter said, his voice a flat, cold monotone. "To the north pasture, an hour after we left the creek. Kerr's a fool. He sent his men for the barn. They think it's a crippling blow. They think we're fighting it." A new, harsh light lit his face. He was not looking at the fire. He was looking at the distant, dark line of willow trace. "They think I am trapped here, saving hay. They think I am occupied." "We have to stop it spreading," Mara said, her eyes on the sparks catching in the dry grass. "You do," he said, turning to her. His plan was already formed. "The shack is what matters. The well is full. There are buckets. Keep the roof wet. Keep the grass around the walls wet. You're not saving the barn. You're just holding this line. Can you do it?" She looked at the wall of flame, then at the small, sturdy shack. I know." He went to his saddle, which was already on his horse. From a saddlebag, he pulled a short, heavy pry bar. "They gave me a diversion. I'm going to use it. To town now. There's no better time." He swung into the saddle. "The men who did this will be on a ridge somewhere, drinking and watching their fire. The rest of the town is asleep." He looked at her, his face a hard mask in the firelight. "Don't open the door for anyone, not even me. Not until I give the 2-knock signal. 1, then 2. Got it. 1, then 2. She repeated. He nodded, and without another word, spurred his horse, not toward the fire, but away from it, disappearing into the darkness at a hard gallop. Coulter rode like a man possessed, using the arroyos and the low ground, his horse's hooves muffled by the dirt. The fire at Ash Mesa was a beacon at his back, a painted, angry sky that proclaimed to all of Willow Trace that the rancher was under attack. He hoped Kerr was watching. He did not ride to the main street. He tethered his horse in the alley behind the blacksmith's, a place of deep shadow. He moved on foot, his boots silent in the dust. The church was dark, a sleeping, holy fortress. But he was not going to the church. He was going to the rectory. The small office attached to the back. The door was locked, a simple, cheap pin tumbler. He wedged the pry bar into the jamb, put his shoulder into it, and it gave one sharp, controlled heave. The wood splintered with a sound like a dry cough. He was inside. The room smelled of old paper, stale pipe tobacco, and the faint, sicky sweet scent of Kerr's cologne. He lit a match, found the lamp on the desk, and turned the wick down so low it was just a yellow teardrop, casting more shadow than light. The room was a map of Kerr's greed. A new desk, expensive. A thick rug. But Coulter went straight for the locked cabinet in the corner. He did not bother with the lock. He used the pry bar again, and the cheap pine door ripped free of its hinges. Inside, he found ledgers, bottles of whiskey, and, at the bottom, a heavy metal deed box. He carried it to the desk. It, too, was locked. He smashed the lock with the heel of the pry bar. He lifted the lid. It was not gold. It was not cash. It was, he realized, so much more. It was a small, heavy iron press, its lever folded. It was a neat wooden tray filled with dozens of rubber-handled stamps, and beneath that, stacks of crisp, blank paper, some printed with the seal of Sable County, some with the letterhead of the circuit court. He pulled out the stamps, holding them in the tiny light. Paid in full. Deceased. Notary Public, Sable County. Last will and testament. And, of course, the parish of St. Bartram. He pulled out the heavy press. He inserted a piece of the blank paper and pulled the lever. He held it to the light. It was a perfect, raised seal of the Sable County Court. This was not a rectory. It was a factory for lies. This was how Kerr and Trammell had operated. The church was just a front for a forgery business, preying on the illiterate, the dying, and the desperate. He was holding the entire rotten conspiracy in his hands. He did not go to the sheriff. He did not go back to the ranch. He swept the press, the stamps, and a handful of the blank, forged papers into a burlap sack and left the rectory, the broken door swinging in the night breeze. He went to Mother Taft's house. He pounded on the door. "Mother Taft, it's Vance, open up." A light appeared. The door opened. The old woman stood there, fully dressed, her shawl around her shoulders. And sitting at the table behind her, holding a cup of cold tea, was Mrs. Lindell. "We saw the fire," Mrs. Lindell said, her voice shaking. We knew it was not the end." "It is now," Coulter said. He upended the sack onto her kitchen table. The two women stared. Mother Taft reached out, her fingers tracing the cold iron of the press. Mrs. Lindell, her eyes wide behind her spectacles, just whispered, Oh, my stars." "He's a forger," Coulter said. "He and Trammell, they've been manufacturing law." Mrs. Lindell's professional outrage overcame her fear. She was a woman of records, of ink and paper. This was a personal, mortal insult. She grabbed the ink pad from the bag. She took a clean sheet of her own kitchen stationery. She picked up the parish of St. Bartram stamp and pressed it hard. Then she took the stamp for the county court of Sable and pressed it right beside the first. She bent low, her nose almost touching the paper. "What is it?" Mother Taft asked, her hands clutching her shawl. A nick." Mrs. Lindell breathed, her finger tracing the letter. "The top of the T in court. It's broken. A tiny, crescent-shaped flaw." Her hand, trembling, moved to the other stamp. "And here, the T in Bartram, it is identical." She looked up at Coulter, her eyes blazing. "It is the same stamp. Mr. Vance, the exact same tool. He just filed off the county of and added the parish of. He was too lazy, or too arrogant, to even make two. This is it. This is the proof. This joins them at the hip." Mother Taft's hands, meanwhile, had been exploring the iron press. Her sensitive, scarred fingers traced the raised letters of the seal. "This is not the county press," she said, her voice firm. "I've held the county press when my poor Henry died. It bites. The edges are sharp as a knife. This is soft. The groove is shallow. It feels greasy. It's a cheap copy. It feels like a lie." Mara had held the line. The barn was a pyramid of glowing, red coals, but the shack was untouched, its roof and the grass around it a dark, soaking marsh. She was covered in soot and ash, her arms aching. When Coulter rode in with the dawn, he did not tell her what he found. He showed her. She looked at the stamps on the table. She looked at the press. She did not weep. Her face, in the gray morning light, was a mask of cold, pure fury. "He used the bell to call them for the lie," she said. "I will use it to call them for the truth." At 7 o'clock, the bell of St. Bartram's began to toll. Not an alarm, Not a summons to prayer, a slow, insistent, angry clang that pulled the town from its beds for the second time in 24 hours. They gathered on the church steps, angry, confused. They found Mara Delaney standing at the altar, which she had dragged to the center of the nave. The church was blazing with every candle she could find. On the altar was the box of stamps and the broken press. Coulter, Mrs. Lindell, and Mother Taft stood behind her. The jury. "You came here yesterday to judge me," Mara's voice rang out, clear and strong. "You were told I was unfit, that I was unclean now. I will show you who the unclean one is." She held up the county court stamp. "This is a lie." She held up the parish stamp. "And this is its brother." She went to the lectern, opened Kerr's parish ledger, the one he kept his private notes in. "Elias Cotter, you remember him? Mr. Abernathy. He died of fever. He left his wife. This—" She held up a forged will, stamped with the false seal, leaving his life savings of $50 to the Church Restoration Fund. "The widow Hemmings," she called out. "Her mortgage, which Reverend Kerr so kindly offered to file for her. He filed it. All right. Stamped paid in full with a false seal. And he kept the bank's money. He stole her farm. One by one." She read the names. The small, petty, devastating betrayals. The stolen burial fees. The forged deeds. The stolen tithes. A low, deep, animal sound began in the pews. It was the sound of a town finally understanding the depth of its betrayal. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named Tom, his face dark with rage, stepped into the aisle. "This is sacrilege. These things, they have no place in this house. Then we will cleanse it," Mara said. She strode to the pot-bellied stove at the back, shoved the iron poker deep into the coals, and waited until it was glowing red. She carried it back to the altar. A torch of justice. "This is not God's work," she said, holding the poker over the box. One by one, the townspeople came forward. Mr. Abernathy, his face a knot of grief and rage, picked up the forged will of Elias Cotter. He did not tear it. He held it to the poker, and it burst into flame. The blacksmith took the rubber stamp marked "Paid in Full." He pressed the red-hot poker to its face. The rubber hissed, melted, and dripped, a black, foul-smelling tear. Mother Taft was led forward. She placed her hands on the iron press. "A lie," she whispered. The blacksmith lifted his hammer, which he had not let go of, and with one precise, shattering blow, broke the press in two on the stone floor. As they destroyed the tools of the crime, Mrs. Lindell, weeping, pulled the bell rope, a steady, clear, cleansing toll, washing the town of its sin. Kerr was found in the livery stable, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of terror, trying to saddle a horse with his one good hand. Horace Bly was gone. His buggy and his gunmen vanished with the dawn. The railroad had cut its losses. The crowd, silent, surrounded Kerr. They did not bring a rope. They dragged him to Judge Trammell's home. Trammell, seeing the destroyed stamps in the blacksmith's hands, seeing Kerr's pathetic state, and seeing the cold, unyielding faces of the entire town on his lawn, visibly crumpled. He sat at his own dining table. I will not be bullied. You will sign, Mrs. Lindell said, placing a piece of paper in front of him. He wrote, his hand shaking, his resignation. And this, Mrs. Lindell said, sliding another paper over. My appointment, as per territorial statute, as interim county recorder, with all judicial powers to seal and protect the county records, pending the arrival of a circuit judge. Trammell signed. His career was over. The crowd turned to Kerr. The bridge, someone growled. A rope. No, Mara said, stepping through. She looked at the man who had tried to destroy her. A weeping, broken, mud-stained creature. She felt nothing. Not pity, not rage, just an ending. You will not hang, she said, her voice cold. That is too easy. You tried to build a wall around my water. You tried to stop this town from moving forward. She pointed toward the Sedgewater. You will build the bridge, the one you and Judge Trammell blocked for 10 years. You will cut the wood. You will quarry the stone. You will work with your one good hand. Until it is done, you will build what you tried to break. It was 3 months later. The bridge, a fine, strong structure of new pine and solid river stone, stood finished. A group of children, screaming with laughter, raced across its planks, their feet making a loud, happy thunder. Below, in the shade of the bridge, Silas Kerr, thin and weathered, his face empty, loaded the last of the tools into a wagon. The blacksmith watched him, his arms crossed. When the wagon was full, the blacksmith pointed, "East, Kerr," without looking back, climbed aboard and drove away, a man erased by his own actions. That evening, Mara stood on the bridge, the new wood warm beneath her hands. The sun was setting, turning the sedge water to gold. Coulter came to stand beside her. He leaned on the railing, his shoulder brushing hers. She touched the smooth, sanded wood. "A bridge," she said, her voice quiet. "All this time, they just wanted to stop people, to take things. They never understood." She looked up at him, a small, true smile touching her lips. He thought he was building his monument. I suppose he was. She laid her hand flat on the top rail, feeling the good, solid grain. A bridge for peace to cross over. Coulter placed his hand over hers. His was calloused and warm. Hers was steady and sure. They stood together, watching the water, free and clear, run beneath their feet. The dawn that followed the cleansing of the church was pale and quiet. The air, washed clean of soot and ash, was sharp. At the Ash Mesa line shack, the smell of the charred, distant barn was finally overpowered by a new, warm-scent, fresh-baked cornbread. Mara was at the stove. She had taken Coulter's dark blue kerchief from her braid and had tied it at her waist. It was a makeshift apron, a flag of domesticity, a claim on the small, scarred room. The light from the single window caught the fine strands of hair that had escaped her braid, turning them to spun gold. She was humming a small, tuneless song, a sound so new to the cabin it felt revolutionary. Coulter came in from the outside. He had been to the well, and his face was damp, his hair slicked back. He had shaved, the hard line of his jaw emerging, clean and defined. He stopped by the door, just watching her. He had seen her as a victim, as a fighter, as a partner in a desperate, dark venture. He had never, until this moment, seen her at peace. He was holding a small, dark, wooden box. It was not fancy, something he had likely carved himself years ago. The wood worn smooth with handling. He set it on the plank table, next to the pitcher of water. The sound it made, a quiet, solid thunk, made her turn. She looked at the box, then at him. Her hum died. A question was in her eyes. He nodded toward it. "For you." She wiped her hands on the kerchief and moved to the table. Her fingers were hesitant. She opened the lid. There was no velvet. There was no ring. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw cotton, was a small, stitched leather pouch. Beside it lay a folded, official-looking paper. She picked up the paper first. Her reading, practiced now, was still slow, but she knew the words. It was the deed, the new, finalized, community trust deed, with Judge Trammell's forced signature at the bottom, and, more importantly, Mrs. Lindell's crisp, clear, interim recorder's seal, making it ironclad. Her name was there, her rights to her home, her land, her life, all spelled out and protected. It was her freedom, on paper. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. It's real. It's real, he said. Mrs. Lindell filed it before the sun was even fully up. Her fingers went to the small leather pouch. It was heavy for its size. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. Not gold, not coins. Seeds, small, brown, unassuming grass seeds. She looked at him, confused. "Drought grass," he said, his voice quiet. "From the high country. I've been harvesting it for 2 seasons. It's stubborn. The roots go deep, deeper than you can imagine. It holds the soil. Even when the wind and the dry come, it survives." He looked at her hand holding the seeds, her other hand on the deed. He had given her back her land, and he had given her the tools to heal it. "Mara," he said, and his voice was rough. She looked up. He did not kneel. He did not recite a poem. He stood, his hands at his sides, his gaze as steady as the mesa itself. "I don't have much," he said. "The barn is gone. The house is small. But if you want it, I have a name. I have this porch. There's a calf crop coming next spring, and the left side of the bed is worn." She stared at him. The man of stone, the man who spoke in single words. He had just offered her his name, his home, his future, and his bed, all in one practical, unadorned, devastating sentence. A sound bubbled up in her throat. It was not a sob. It was a laugh, a real, true, unrestrained laugh. It was a sound of such profound relief, of such sudden, impossible joy, that it startled them both. She laughed until the tears she had refused to shed for terror, for rage, for loss, finally came. They streamed down her face, unchecked. "Coulter Vance," she whispered, her voice thick. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She did not throw herself at him. She put her hand, the one filled with grass seeds, flat on his chest, right over his heart. She felt it, a strong, steady, powerful beat, solid, like the land, like the man himself. "It's enough," she said, her voice breaking. "It's enough to build a house on." He let out the breath he had been holding. His arms came around her, pulling her against him. This was not the desperate, storm-driven embrace of that night. This was a claiming. This was a choice. He buried his face in her hair, and she could smell the clean, sharp scent of the soap he had used, the scent of new sun. He tilted her chin up, and he kissed her. It was a slow, deep, unhurried kiss. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke, of salt and cornbread, of a life beginning. His rough wool coat, the one he wore that first night, was still on its peg, and as he held her, his arm brushed it. The sound, a soft, dry rustle, was like the turning of a page. There was no wedding, there was no church, no white dress, no ring. There was, instead, a supper. That evening, Mother Taft made the journey up to the shack, riding Coulter's mule. She came, she said, to inspect the new foundation. She brought with her an apple pie from Mrs. Lindell, who had baked it that afternoon, just to use up the last of the fall apples, she had claimed. They ate at the plank table. A simple stew, Mara's cornbread, and the pie. It was a feast, afterward, as the stars began to blanket the sky in a thick diamond dust. Coulter sat on the porch step. He pulled a small, worn harmonica from his pocket. He tapped it against his palm, and then began to play. It was not a hymn. It was a slow, simple, aching folk tune, a melody that spoke of long roads and lonely nights, but had, at its heart, a thread of hope. Mara sat on the step beside him, her shoulder resting against his. Mother Taft, in the cabin's only chair, rocked slowly, listening, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. They watched a meteor, a shooting star, trail a line of brief, green fire across the black. Later, Coulter helped Mother Taft back onto the mule. "You built a good bridge, child," the old woman said to Mara, her strong, scarred fingers patting her hand. "Now you make sure you live on it." Mara watched her go, a small, indomitable shadow, until she disappeared down the trail. She turned and went back into the cabin. Coulter followed, closing the door. The single lantern cast its warm, golden circle. The cabin was quiet. Their home, his heavy wool coat, the one that had been her first shield, the one that had been her blanket, was lying in a heap on the cot. Mara picked it up. She felt the weight of it, the coarse, honest wool. She remembered the smell of him on that first terrible night. Slowly, with deliberate care, she folded it. She folded it not as a thing to be put away, but as a thing to be honored. She draped it over the high back of the single, straight-backed wooden chair, setting it at the head of the table. It was a standard, a flag, her sovereignty, soft and warm. Coulter was by the stove, watching her. He had not spoken. Now, he held out his hand. "There's no music," she whispered, her voice catching. "There's music," he answered. She walked to him and placed her hand in his. He drew her to the small, open space in the center of the room. His other hand, broad and warm, settled on the small of her back. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, and they danced. It was barely a dance. It was a slow sway, their feet hardly moving on the rough floorboards. They turned, slowly, in the small, warm pool of the lantern light. He held her securely, leading her in a small, tight circle, his steps sure. He was a man who knew his ground. He stopped swaying, just held her close. He bent his head, his lips brushing the side of her hair. "The first night," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "Of our house." He kept one arm around her as he reached, with his free hand, and turned down the wick of the lamp. The flame sputtered, flared, and died, plunging the room into the soft, silver light of the stars coming through the window. He led her to the cot, outside. The door was closed. The heavy oak bar Coulter had carved, the bar of defense, rested against the wall, unused. On the porch step, a second coat. The one he had worn that day was folded neatly, not against the cold of the night to come, but in memory of the life that had been warmed and saved and begun. The cabin was a small, dark, sleeping shape, secure at last, under a silent, watching sky. 1 year, a full turn of the seasons. The high plains wind still scoured the mesas. The sun was still a hammer in August, and the snows of winter were still deep and unforgiving. The land did not change, but the people had. The Ash Mesa line shack was no longer a shack. It was the first part of a house. Coulter, with the help of the town blacksmith, had added 2 new rooms, built of solid pine. The front porch, once a narrow plank, was now a wide, deep veranda that ran the length of the building. It was known, now, in Willow Trace, as the open porch. It was not just a home. It was the new heart of the community's memory. One of the new rooms was a small, quiet library. It held the books Mara's mother had owned, the books Coulter had kept in a trunk, and new ones, brought in by the circuit riders. But the most important items were on a sturdy oak shelf that Coulter had built, the new official ledgers of the Sedgewater Community Trust. Once a month, the board Mrs. Lindell, her eyes sharp as ever, Mrs. Abernathy, practical and fair, and Mother Taft. Her mind, still a steel trap, would sit on that porch with Mara. The ledgers were open. Any citizen could come and see the accounting, the water level measurements, the funds held in reserve. After a generation of Kerr's hidden books and Trammell's forged seals, the town's business was finally done in the open air, where everyone could see it. And in the afternoons, the children came. Mara, her apron now made of sturdy ticking, not a borrowed kerchief, taught them their letters. They sat on the porch steps, their slates in their laps. They were not just learning to read scripture. They were learning to read the maps. They learned to find Sedgewater Creek, to find the sycamore, to trace the line of their own family properties. They learned to find and to write their own names. The land, Mara wrote in her journal, finally had a voice, and the children were learning its language. The world outside had changed. 2. Horace Bly, a man who never wasted money on a fight he could not win, had seen the ironclad trust. He had seen the united town. He had, with a pragmatic curse, rerouted his railroad. The new spur line now ran 2 miles south of the Delaney land, giving the Sedgewater a wide, respectful berth. But the railroad needed a water stop and a cattle loading station. A small, bustling depot was built where the new line crossed the main cattle trail. The sign, painted in fresh black letters, read, "Delaney Crossing." Of the old regime, little remained. Silas Kerr, as promised, had finished the bridge. He had worked with his one good hand. his clerical black replaced by the rough, sweat-stained clothes of a laborer, his silver hair grown long and lank. The town did not speak to him. They did not jeer him. They simply did not see him. When the last plank was set, he loaded his few remaining possessions into a cart and rode east, out of the territory. No one threw a stone. No one waved goodbye. Oblivion, Mara had learned, was the longest, heaviest sentence of all. Judge Trammell had found a different, harder path to redemption. He sold his fine house and, with the money, bought the town forge from the blacksmith, who was ready to retire. Trammell, a man who had never done a day of physical labor, now worked from sunup to sundown. He was covered in soot. His hands, once soft and clean for signing false papers, were now blistered, burned, and calloused. He sweated for his sins. He hammered hot iron, the rhythmic, deafening clang of his anvil a kind of penance. The townspeople said that with every blow, another of his old false seals was broken. That autumn, the High Plains curse returned. A drought, hard and biting, settled on the land. For 2 months, no rain fell. The air grew brown with dust. The smaller creeks dried up, just as they had in the year Coulter's wife had died. The ranchers in the basin began to sell off their cattle, their faces grim. But on Ash Mesa, something different was happening. Coulter stood on the rise, looking out over his pasture. Where before there had been cracked, red earth, there was now a thin, stubborn, pale green fuzz. The drought grass, the seeds Mara had held in her palm, the seeds he had planted, had taken, their roots, deep and tenacious, were holding the soil. They were finding the deep, hidden moisture. His cattle, thin but healthy, were grazing, their heads low. The seeds had worked. The tiny, humble promise, made in a wooden box, had saved them. Mara walked up to stand beside him. He did not look at her. He just slipped his arm around her waist. Pulling her close, she laid her head on his shoulder, and they watched their cattle survive. That Sunday afternoon, the bell rang. In the year that had passed, St. Bartram's had found a new circuit preacher, a young, earnest man who spoke more of harvests than of damnation. But the bell was the town's. The old, frayed rope had finally snapped. A new one was needed. The women of the town, led by Mother Taft, had gathered. They brought their own spinning twine, their hemp rope, the strong flax threads they used for stitching harnesses, and sitting in the sun on the church steps, they had braided it, all of them. Their hands, old and young, scarred and smooth, had worked together, weaving a single, thick, unbreakable rope. When the bell rang now, it was not a sound of judgment or alarm. It was a new sound, full, clear, and steady. It was the sound of a community, calling itself home. Mara and Coulter had walked to town for the service. Afterward, they stood on the church steps, the same steps where she had huddled, a broken, terrified girl in a torn dress, the same spot where he had first stood, a shadow, a stranger, a shield. The late afternoon sun was warm. She was wearing a simple calico dress, and his old coat was folded over her arm. She was, he realized, beautiful in the daylight. She leaned against him, her shoulder pressing into his side, her hand finding his. He looked down at her, at the top of her head, the sun catching the red in her dark hair. He felt a wave of something, not just love, not just peace, a profound, bone-deep rightness. He squeezed her hand. "Just stay standing," he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes, the color of the prairie sky after a storm, crinkling at the corners. "Always," she said. She rose on her toes and kissed him, right there on the church steps, in the full, golden light of the afternoon. The view pulled back, up, away from the two small figures on the steps. It rose above the steeple, above the new, true bell. It rose high, showing the small, bright square of willow trace, glowing in the late sun. It showed the dark, gleaming line of the railroad, bent now, respectfully, around the protected land. It showed the silver, winding thread of the Sedgewater, running free and clean. It showed the new bridge, solid and strong, connecting the town, and it showed, farther out, high on the mesa, the solid, welcoming shape of the open porch, a new map, drawn not with ink and paper, but with courage and water, and a compassion as hard and as durable as the rock itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear from you. So please comment below to let us know where in the world you are listening from. Share your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.